Really good to have you with us, and we are picking up the next message on our series on avoiding the drift as we think about the very real danger to our spiritual health at this time. I spoke last week of the way in which a boat, as it crosses the Atlantic, has to be very aware of the impact of what's been called set and drift, ocean currents that can, if not careful, mean that vessel ends up way off course as a result of not making course corrections. But you'll know that you don't need to be in a boat and you don't need to be very far from the shore to experience this kind of thing. If you've ever been on holiday on the beach on an inflatable, you'll know that there are some very real invisible currents not very far from the shoreline itself, and that before you know it, you can end up drastically off course. So if you're not careful, you end up miles away from where you started. I don't know if you heard the account recently of the 4-year-old girl who was swept out to sea on an inflatable unicorn in Greece. I mean, every parent's worst nightmare. Apparently the 4-year-old girl, according to the report, was on a big inflatable unicorn and was swept half a mile out to sea. The child, who was in the sea off the course of Antirio, Corinth, had reportedly escaped her parents' attention and floated away. Local media reports say when they realized that their daughter was out of sight, that they contacted the port authorities, who then alerted the captain of a local ferry. The captain found the child in the middle of the sea and maneuvered the inflatable unicorn to safety. Ferry workers waited as they inched closer towards the floating girl, and then they lunged and pulled her out of the water to safety. The little girl, wearing pink, showed great strength as she calmly held onto the unicorn while the boat crew rescued her, and the crew pulled her and the toy out of the water to safety. The girl was reportedly returned to her parents unharmed. But the local media reported that this was not the first time that beachgoers had been swept out to sea. We're thinking about the very real potential for drift spiritually in our lives. We're in a prolonged season where spiritual drift is a very real risk to all of us. And whilst we do need to be very aware of the very real physical threat of this virus, of the very real increasing economic threat that is looming over us as a result of the restrictions that are in place in response to the virus, there is, of course, alongside that, another invisible but very real threat, and it's a spiritual threat. It's the tendency to drift. Not to make some kind of dramatic overnight U-turn in our Christian lives, but to experience something of a very steady but incremental erosion of our spiritual vitality and health. One of the consequences of the restrictions that we are having to function within is that this very real but invisible current is pulling at us. I wonder if you've felt it. You may feel it as you log in to online church. Last week we spoke of online church as a kind of powdered, dehydrated food source, the kind of thing that you might have to eat if you are in space. It helps keep you alive, but it's not the real thing. I wonder how those astronauts feel on the space station, having spent months eating this stuff as they tear open another foil packet. I bet they're dreaming of steaming curry and rice and steak and chips. Well, they still eat their space food because they know that their survival depends on it. Well, we're now 6 months plus in, and some of us, I guess, are feeling a bit sick of powdered church. And the longer the situation continues, the higher the risk that there is that we will experience something of a spiritual drift in our lives. And that's a danger that the book of Hebrews picks up, and we are referencing a number of themes and verses in Hebrews as we explore this together. Chapter 2, verse 1 to 3 says this: "For this reason, we must pay attention all the more to what we've heard, so that we will not drift away. For if the message spoken through angels was legally binding, and every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation?" The writer here speaks of drift, and he uses this word, neglect. Last time I spoke of the danger of drift. But whilst we can be completely confident that Jesus' church will emerge from this season, will continue to flourish and grow and play a central part within God's purposes on the earth, we may, however, find that like Gideon's army, she emerges visibly smaller in some ways. And that won't be the result of a dramatic collapse of faith. It will rather be the result of a steady but sustained spiritual drift over a prolonged period of time. And we're all susceptible to that, especially at this time and under the conditions that we find ourselves in. The writers that the Christians that the writer here addresses in Hebrews, they've got a rich history of radical obedience. They're not lightweight Christians. They've got a very close association with Jesus' church. And yet now they face the danger of drift. And you and I would be naive and presumptuous if we think we're somehow immune to this danger. So having flagged up the danger of drift, I want to just mention some specific areas where we need to be aware of drift potentially happening in our lives. I want to put some buoys in the water, if you like, which help us recognize where, in fact, we may already be drifting off course, so we can make some course corrections. The word neglect is used several times in the book of Hebrews. The writer uses the word in this verse we read, but throughout the letter, this notion of a neglect of certain things comes through. He mentions a specific number of things that we must be careful not to neglect, and he uses the opposite phrase, paying attention, to urge us to make the course corrections that are needed to avoid the kind of neglect he's warning against. Now, I believe this is a time for us to be paying attention all the more to certain things that are important. And if we don't do that purposefully, if we don't do that intentionally, then we may well find that we end up in significant drift over this season. What are some of the things then that we're called to pay attention to? Let's mention some of these buoys in the water. First of all, vision drift. The primary concern of the writer to the Hebrews is that these Christians will take their eyes off of the glory and uniqueness of who Jesus is and what he's done for them as their great high priest. He's not so much concerned that they'll make some dramatic outright rejection of Jesus, that they'll abandon Jesus, but that over time they'll become less and less preoccupied with this Jesus and his work for them. When the writer speaks in chapter 2 of the need to pay attention all the more to what we've heard and to not neglect such a great salvation, he is, of course, building on what he's already written in chapter 1. And if you know Hebrews chapter 1, you'll know it's one of those majestic chapters that speaks of the glory of Christ and the greatness of his work. And the letter itself is mainly teaching about the glory of Jesus and his work as our great high priest on our behalf. Before he gets to this exhortation in chapter 2, he spends a whole chapter reminding us of the way in which this Jesus is so supreme and so glorious. That's where he begins. Unlike many of the other New Testament letters, he skips any of the usual introductions and he launches straight into the theme of his letter. He says this: long ago God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times and in different ways. In these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. He just dives straight into the deep end of the majesty of Jesus. He brings us face to face with the glory of Christ. What does he say about this Jesus? Well, he says he's God's final word. He's not one among many pointing to some great universal truth that's out there. He is the very embodiment of truth. God's full and final revelation, the chief definitive means through which God communicates to men and women. The radiance of God's glory, the one through whom we experience the matchless majesty of God, the one who shines on us with all the inherent holiness and goodness and beauty of God's own nature. He is the exact imprint of his nature, the one who said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." The perfect representation of God, the upholder of all things, the one whose words have creative and sustaining power, the whole cosmos existing and being sustained by his sovereign word, all of creation serving his will and his purpose. The purifier of sins, the one whose work on the cross provides a complete, perfect solution for the dire problem of our sin. The one who, on the basis of that work, gives us full forgiveness and pardon and cleanses us on the inside. The one who sits in supreme authority at the right hand of the Majesty on high, above all created things, above angels, above archangels, above the devil and his demons, above human governments, above empires, above presidents, above prime ministers. Jesus seated above them all. That's just the first few verses of his letter. What we're being called to see here in Hebrews afresh is the glory of Christ. We're being called to pay close attention to Jesus. And that's at the heart of how we avoid drift. Drift happens when we begin to become over familiar with these themes, even flippant. When we begin to slip into a dutiful religious routine that lacks vital passion and enthusiasm. And that's easily done when we're having to get by on a powdered, dehydrated version of church, when we're sat staring at a screen, singing in our living room, isolated from others, not surrounded by other disciples, singing with passion, with one voice, expressing their enthusiasm, when we're not able to benefit from the heat and passion and enthusiasm of a gathered body of disciples. We're having to exist like coals separated from other coals. Very easy at seasons like this for our vision of the glory of Jesus and our enthusiasm for him to just adrift. And that means it becomes all the more important that we pay all the more attention to this Jesus. The writer speaks of his supremacy, his priestly work on our behalf. Throughout the letter again and again, he reminds us to remain focused on Jesus. He says in verse 8 of chapter 2, we don't see everything yet subjected to him, but we do see Jesus, goes on to speak of him crowned with glory and honor. Hebrews 3 speaks of how we who share in a heavenly calling are called to consider this Jesus, the apostle and high priest. And then in chapter 12, we're called to run the race with endurance, keeping our eyes on Jesus. We spent the last week of our series in Habakkuk looking at the importance of being preoccupied with Jesus at a time of upheaval. Not preoccupied with the latest graphs and charts and statistics, with the latest doom and gloom predictions of an economy that is spiraling out of control. Not ignorant of those things, but not preoccupied with them. I believe that the church that emerges from this strange season that we're in on course will consist of those who have managed to remain preoccupied with Jesus in the midst of this season. One of the features of this sustained season is that we are having to do what the generation in the wilderness had to learn to do, and that was daily gather their own manna in order to feed themselves and share it with others. God miraculously and in his extraordinary grace during that prolonged season in the wilderness gave them manna from heaven. It was a means of his grace, and it kept them alive for 40 years. But it wasn't delivered to their doorstep. It didn't appear on the table. It had to be gathered. They had to undertake a daily journey. Every day there was a need to gather manna. They had to share it with one another. Moses wasn't there as the sole distributor of manna. They had to gather their own manna and share it amongst themselves. They had to take what God had given them by his grace, gather it up and feed upon it. Psalm 16 puts it in a slightly different way. The psalmist says, I've set the Lord always before me. The NIV says, I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. When we're enjoying the benefits of normal church life, you remember what that was like. We can, in some senses, begin to rely on others to be setting the Lord before us. We can rely on others to put the manna on the table, or even actually spoon feed us the manna that's going to keep us alive. Fellow disciples around us, those who lead us in worship, those who preach and teach. We're, of course, in those seasons in an environment where that's all we're doing as we gather together. We're setting the Lord before us in our singing, as people around us pray, as they share, as the word is preached. But in the absence of that, or in a diluted version of that, or a powdered version of that, which is what we are having to live on, it is now far more important that we're doing that for ourselves. How do we do that? Well, it's not rocket science. Within the particular situations that we live in, we have to make a choice to creatively but deliberately carve out time to engage with this Jesus in a focused way, to employ whatever means God's given us: prayer, worship, meditation on his word. There are some particularly helpful passages in the New Testament. Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, 15 to 20, Revelation 1, 12 to 20, the Gospels themselves. That's a great place to go to gather manna, to feed yourself on a fresh vision of who Jesus is. So I wonder, first of all, are you experiencing vision drift? What are you preoccupied with? Is your vision of Jesus shrinking somewhat over this season? Is he less captivating, less compelling? And what are you doing to set the Lord continually before you? Secondly, faith drift is the second buoy in the water. If you're familiar with the book of Hebrews, you'll know the central theme is one of faith. One of the ways in which the Christians the writer is addressing are drifting is in terms of their confidence and the confidence that they have in convictions that they've held. In chapter 10, the writer says, don't throw away your confidence. And he's been there referring to the way in which in the past they took some very clear stand and embraced some measure of persecution as a result of having very clear convictions and identifying alongside those who stood by those clear convictions. It seems now that they are in danger of drifting from those convictions, from that confidence. They're throwing away their confidence. And within the letter, he speaks a lot about the need to continue to have confidence in God and in his word. The verse that we read from chapter 2 urges them to pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift from it. The danger here then, and the writer includes himself in it, is that we lose confidence in what we have heard, what we have known to be true. The teaching, the preaching, the revelation that God's given us in his word is over time, during a sustained season like this, being undermined and eroded. Where we were once so clear about things and confident about certain convictions, we now find ourselves drifting. We may even find ourselves drifting beyond the buoys of what the church down through history has held to be true. A dangerous place for us to end up. Faith drift. We may even drift into a backwater of cynicism to such a degree that we then become impervious to any course corrections. And we're all vulnerable to this at seasons where we're living in. One of the benefits that we have when we're able to gather with the church in person is that we are collectively reminded of truth. Together we sing with one voice, truth. There's power in that. We hear truth restated as it's prayed aloud, as it's prophesied. We may even confess truth together in those contexts, in the forms of creeds or confessions. And the result is that we find ourselves with a rhythm in life where we are regularly in an environment when our convictions are being continually rehearsed and reinforced. But when we find ourselves isolated from that kind of environment, it becomes far easier for us to drift away from those convictions, to find ourselves blown off course by some other wind of teaching, as the Bible puts it. It's on the back of Paul's magnificent teaching in Ephesians about the body and the role of apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists who serve and equip the church to promote the health of the body of the church, that he speaks of the way in which we are, as a result of that, no longer children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine. But when we're in a season where we're living with a very real detachment from those gifts of the ascended Christ within the context of the body of the church, we are susceptible to drift. We need to ensure, therefore, that we are deliberately feeding ourselves on truth. I want to encourage you to do what it takes to feed yourself in these days on truth, to get to grips with the kind of themes that Hebrews itself sets before us, the supremacy of Christ, his priestly work on our behalf, the gospel itself. Get hold of some of these confessions. Read them aloud. I've been reading through the Heidelberg Catechism this week, which has been a tremendous blessing. Read them aloud around the meal table as a family. Avoid faith drift. Rehearse the things that you know are true. Wonder how you're doing when it comes to faith drift. I wonder if you're experiencing an erosion, you're finding something of an undermining of your confidence, even a growing cynicism. Core convictions that you once held so confidently that you're just now not so sure about. There's a rising fog of doubt, perhaps rising. Third thing is obedience drift, and in many ways this is just the outcome of the first two. When we lose our preoccupation with Jesus, when we drift a little in our confidence in his revealed word and its authority over our lives, we then inevitably make choices in life that reflect that. In chapter 3, the writer reminds us of that generation that were delivered from Egypt and enjoyed a rich history of God's interventions, but then tragically failed to enter the promised land. They ended up way off course. In chapter 3, the writer says, watch out, brothers and sisters, so that there won't be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily while it's still cool today, so that none of you is hardened by sin's deception. For we've become participants in Christ if we hold firmly until the end the reality that we had at the start. That's avoiding the drift. As it is said today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. For who heard and rebelled? Wasn't it all who came out of Egypt under Moses? With whom was God angry for 40 years? Wasn't it with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, if not those who disobeyed? Here we have the example of a whole generation that had taken some massive, costly steps of obedience. They'd responded to the call to leave Egypt. They'd slaughtered the Passover lamb. They'd heeded God's voice. They'd done everything God had required. They'd followed Moses through the Red Sea. Fast forward, and tragically, this same community is marked by disobedience and rebellion. There's a massive obedience drift. They've ended up way off course. There's been a hardening of the heart, a steady cumulative resistance to God's loving demands over their lives. And the result is they tragically miss their destiny. And the writer uses this generation as an example to put a clear buoy in the water and warn the Christians he's writing to avoid disobedience drift. Interestingly, Paul, in one of his letters to the Corinthians, uses the exact same example to bring a note of warning to the Christians in Corinth. So this is where vision drift and faith drift always lead to. When we take our eyes off Jesus and lose confidence in his revealed word and its authority over our lives, we end up making choices marked by disobedience, which themselves have serious consequences in terms of our spiritual health and our ability to enter into the things that God's called us to. Behavior follows belief. Bad behavior follows bad belief. We end up in a place of obedience drift. So I wonder what steps of obedience Jesus might be calling you to at this time. What sacrifices he's calling you to make. What's his word to you in the wilderness? Today, if you hear his voice, soften your heart. Find grace to make the right choices. This is another buoy in the water. What's your response to what God's saying? Is it a happy, responsive obedience? Or maybe it's a hardening. Maybe it's a continual rationalizing, a justifying of choices and behavior. Let's do what it takes to maintain hearts that are not growing hard, but are sensitive and responsive to what God's saying. Let's take note then of these buoys in the water that mark out areas we can be prone to drift in. And let's recognize that we're all vulnerable to this. Yesterday's devotion is yesterday's devotion. Yesterday's confident convictions are yesterday's confident convictions. And yesterday's obedience, however radical that obedience might have been, is yesterday's obedience. Today, if you hear his voice. Let's avoid vision drift. Let's set the Lord continually before us. Let's feed ourselves on the manna that we ourselves are gathering. Let's avoid faith drift, and let's avoid obedience drift. Let me pray, and then we're going to end there. Father, thank you for grace available. Thank you for the fact that you're holding on to us. And we want to acknowledge our vulnerability, our propensity even, when we are missing the benefits of normal, in-person church life, to drift. And we say, Father, help us not to do that. I pray that you'd bring conviction to our hearts where that needs to happen. And I pray for faith and grace to make clear course corrections. Help us to set the Lord continually before us. We want to emerge from this time more preoccupied with Jesus than we've ever been. We want to grow stronger and more deeply rooted in our convictions. And we want to be those that are responsive to your voice, who are willing to say, Lord, whatever you say, we'll do. We pray for a heart of obedience in Jesus' name.